And you came to river running in the mid 1960s when you were just a teenager. How did that happen?
Actually, I attribute a lot of that to the influence of my mother. Um, we as a family, we always had a love for the outdoors. We would, go out on camping trips over the coast or to the Sierras or anything like that, and hiking. And my mother ended up working. She worked at the time with Caltrans, and fellow that she worked with was into rafting, and he was an older gentleman, and so he needed some help on moving rafts around. Of course, we're talking military rafts that weigh well in excess of 200 pounds or so, and just moving those things around. So it was a perfect blend in my mother's eyes of what to do with two teenage boys that are sitting around the house for the summer, and blending that with their love for the outdoors and keeping them interested and off the streets. So that's kind of what we got started with. That was Bill Weber. Bill Weber was just a wonderful mentor. He took us down the American River numerous times there, showed us how to operate rafts, showed us how to read the water. And later, after he had a heart attack, he ended up giving my brother and I the rafts and the equipment that he had used for years. So that kind of was, and the genesis there with that. And like I said, it's my mother, and she always was ready to go on any river trip. She never learned how to swim, but she was always ready to just pack up and go with her kids on any raft trip that they proposed. So from Bill Weber, it just moved on, morphed into ARDA and everything. Commercial river running. We from Bill Weber introduced me over towards Lawrence Smith. Lawrence Smith was looking for boatmen because he was going to be working for Lou Elliott and running the Stanislaus River. He needed some guides, and so he took on my brother and I, Duncan and I, and then from there Lauren was then in charge of operating up on the Rogue River in Oregon, and then over onto the Idaho, the Middle Fork, and the main salmon. With those years working with ARDA, learned a lot about people more than anything else. River running is one thing, but the people that go along on the river, that's really a telling point. That's one of the joys.
And you were just 16 or 17.
I was just 16, and if you can only imagine trusting your life to a 16-year-old kid as you're going down the Rogue River, or a 16-year-old kid as you're going down the Middle Fork of the Salmon, there was some trepidation in people's eyes. I could never understand it, but there was some trepidation in their eyes. That continued on into the late 1960s. Then in 69, then is when I turned around and volunteered, went into the service, went into the Marines.
In 1971, you got out of the Marines. What were you thinking at that point? What were you feeling?
My initial feeling after I got out of the Marines is I wanted to see what I had been fighting for. I really wanted to see a lot more of the country. I wanted to see what other people in the United States did, and why in the world we had gone to Vietnam to begin with. And then secondly, why did I risk my life and the lives of others? Because in the Marines, I had been a non-commissioned officer, and which gave associated with that a lot of responsibility of telling who was going to walk point when you had to go on ambushes and a variety of things. So I wanted to see the United States, and I also wanted to make a difference in the world.
Okay, Mark, your history. How did you get here?
In high school, I got interested in caves. The most amazing stash of caves in California was along the Stanislaus, and I had caved in other places, and finally the Mother Lode Grotto National Speleological took me to this place called Goldtooth, and we were halfway down Camp 9 Road, up on top of a bluff, and after coming out of this interesting little cave that there wasn't much in it, but they pointed to the river below and said, "Oh yeah, and they're going to build a dam on that." And I remember thinking, "That looks like a really beautiful canyon. That's too bad." But I'd been raised with going to dam sites growing up, so I figured that's the way it is. And about a week later, my brother says, "Hey, remember in high school at Hiram Johnson, I ran into one of our classmates, Ron Coldwell, and he invited me on a river trip. Well, we went down that same Camp 9 road to the beginning of the Stanislaus." Oh, wow, what a coincidence. And so I spent a number of years going into the canyon looking for caves, and then by the time I would join my brother Gar and Ron and others going down in little duckies, little 4-mans that we had 2 of us in, and so began to learn the river. And by 1970, my brother said, "Hey, you want to work for ARDA?" And I'm, "Oh, okay." So I worked weekends, went up every weekend. I was working at a bottled water company, but started going down, and you get paid for this? And the next weekend, all my contemporary ARDA guys were sent off to rivers all over the West. And Rob Elliott, who ran ARDA, said, "We want you to stay and be area manager." Oh, okay. So I, with Dick Linford, he and I headed up the trips and organized things, and then this crazy guy had an idea that was Rob offered me to go anywhere in the state or in the West, and Fred's idea was too powerful. So
We'll come back and revisit that. But you, Mark, this was through 1970 that you were area managing in California on the Stanislaus and all. Yeah. I go through.
Head guide, area manager. I mean, finding campsites on the American and working out details.
Fred, how did you get to the river?
I was going to college after the Air Force in Sacramento, and
you served in Vietnam era in the Air Force.
Era, yes. I was in the Air Force, and in '69 got out and was going to American River College, and happened to go down to the Fair Oaks River, American River, down at Fair Oaks, and I saw people going by in little boats, and thought that looked like they fun. They just kind of float on by, and that looked like a fun thing to do. So a couple of us jumped in the river and would just swim along and look at the banks go by. And after that, we were able to find a place that rented boats, and so we rented a boat, and we were able to go a little further than swimming. And then we thought, well, there's rivers up in the mountains, and somebody thought of calling the Sierra Club, and they put us in touch with Ron and Duncan. Well, Ron wasn't there right at that moment, but we got in touch with his brother Duncan, and he said, "Well, do you want a job?" And so, of course, rowing boats. And that's how I got to know Ron.
And the Stanislaus. And that was the beginning River. Of the whole river adventure.
Stanislaus, the American. And it took a while, but they taught me how to row.
The thread in here, in all of these connections, is that you guys really knew each other in Sacramento in various ways and brought that connection with each other to what you were eventually going to make into, et cetera. How did you think about each other in getting to that point? I mean, Mark, you sort of saw Fred. Fred, you saw Mark. How did that relationship get built?
I was working for Duncan Coldwell, who was starting a river trip.
A river company, yeah.
River companies. And Ron just came back as I was completing or halfway through the first year. Ron came back from Vietnam. And I can't remember exactly how we got in the same house, but we all ended up in X Street. And I think even Mark's brother Gar ended up there for a time too. And Duncan ended up there until he moved out. We were having it was for the 72 season. We all kind of met up at the X Street house. There was all boatmen or boatman wannabes, like all of us. And we were trying to figure out where to be the next year. And Mark knew that he could go anywhere he wanted. And Ron basically could too, because he'd been in it for a long time. And we were trying to decide, we were filling out this ARDA questionnaire on what do you do, what can you do? And we were also discussing money and what river trips cost. And I just, it just seemed funny that we were talking about money, but we were doing something that all of us just would do for nothing. And I think that's the idea just started to happen there.
Mark, what do you remember about that conversation?
I recall that Fred had actually planted the seed ahead of time about the idea of taking inner city kids down. And so we all came together in this little room to have a conversation, and everyone had a slightly different interest. My brother really wanted to use river trips for meditation. Mike Sneed, another guide, wanted to exchange with people who did, light flying, and we'd trade off. And Ron clearly had other things going. And in the morning, I remember talking to Fred, and it was like, I'd been come to it so excited, and it was clear that, well, gee, well, hey, at least you and I seem to be into the same idea, so okay, let's just plan on it, even though I was going to be gone all fall and spring, and he was going to be traveling too, but when we get back in the spring, we'll do it.
So this would have been in 72 or 71?
71,
late 71. Tell us a little bit, Ron, about how did you think about Mark and Fred when they first started showing up on the scene? Little did you know that you guys were going to have a partnership later.
And speak loud.
Yeah, okay. I pretty much, Fred and I were roommates. I had been with the Marines in Vietnam, and so probably also as a result of seeing some pretty horrific stuff in Vietnam, had what you'd call survivor's guilt. Later on, and I got out in 1971, immediately pretty much got into renting a house with Duncan and Fred, and the three of us were roommates, and I kind of wanted to make a difference in the world. I kind of had that feeling as if there had to be some reason why I escaped unharmed, and felt a need to make a difference. Well, Fred, the wonderful man that he is, had come up with an idea that said, these river trips where people are going down and paying money, we're probably missing out on a huge segment of the population that could really benefit from that, and that is if we were to offer free river trips. And I had known Mark from high school, and so it really integrated in with Fred and Mark. And Fred, if I recall correctly, had proposed to several people, well, what do you think about if we started doing free river trips? And then from a lot of people said, well, that sounds like a great idea, but I need to cover the rent, and I need to make some money, and so it's a great idea, but I can't do it. Well, Mark said, yes, that sounds like a wonderful idea. This is my memory with it. And then pretty much it was Mark and Fred, and I was on the sidelines for several weeks, and then finally decided, yeah, that sounds like a great plan, and I really like Fred's idea that we should be doing free river trips. And it might have been several weeks, it might have been several months, but the more I kept pondering it, the more I kept thinking, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. We need to focus on people that just can't afford it, whether in an orphanage or if they're from the inner city of Oakland or wherever the case may be. Let's start helping out some other people. So that's kind of how I got involved with all of it.
Etc. When it got started had all these rough edges that wasn't really even it was just a notion. And how did you go from being a notion to actually having rafts and a truck and ready to do regular trips?
Well, I will say that again, Fred already had a raft, so he was covered. I'm ready to do it, but I don't have a raft. Master Ron knew how to figure out where the surplus sales were with all the military. So at some point he would go in and talk to these guys, and at some point he takes us to Mare Island. And he's going, in this case, well, there's no surplus sales going on. And Ron says, well, but who does the repairs? Can we go talk to somebody? And so before long, we're now driving across the base, and we go into a building the size of a football field, and outside you can smell rubber. And you go inside, and there were literally hundreds and hundreds of boats, all pumped up out on the floor. The walls was stacked high with columns of rubber rafts. And Ron quickly again, well, what glue do you use? How do you repair these things? And then he says, well, do you ever get rid of them? Oh yeah, there's one in the dumpster right now. Oh, could we have it? And he said, well, sure. So we drive around the building just in time.
And what are you driving?
Oh, we're driving my 57 Volkswagen Bug. So we drive around the building.
With three men in it.
Yeah, three of us in it. And so just as we get there, the dump truck is dumping it into the dumpster. And we're going from the dumpster. Oh no. So now we slowly follow the dump truck. And he goes out, and now the signs say, unauthorized area, you can't trespass here. So we watch from there. We watch the guy go out in the middle of the Bayfill. He dumps the truck. And so as he comes out, we go on in and we drive out, and there's all of these rafts and all of the gear, the first aid, the repairs, the paddles, all these rescue life rafts that are part of the Navy. And with that, we see this vehicle, an MP comes on, and now Ron finally says the full truth. Well, and he said, well, I'm sorry, but you can't take anything off the base without a chip, and you can only get that from the base commander. So we now drive off with the little Volkswagen, and we go find the base commander, and he listens to our story, and he says, well, you can't take any rafts, but you could take patching rubber. And anything else, just give me a list of what you take. And so we went back on out. We were able to take 3 basket boats and jam them into this little, Volkswagen. And Fred was squeezed on top. We had hand pumps and these paddles. And food rations and C-clamps that you repaired them with. Underneath, jammed on my feet. Only Ron could drive. There was not enough room. And that's what got etc. started with enough rafting equipment to get us down the river.
I thought, boy, if we could score access to this stuff, we would have so much equipment. This would be wonderful. And but while we're loading the equipment into the Volkswagen Bug, we're watching this bulldozer out here at this dump. And of course, the rafts had CO2 canisters that if you hit it correctly, it would inflate the raft immediately. And the bulldozer driver kind of seemed to just relish the idea of hitting those canisters, having the raft inflate, and then him just running right over the whole thing. And it was a sad sight to see, but as we're loading the car.
You guys now have rafts. but you don't have any way to really transport stuff. You've got people
We have a
wanting to go on
Volkswagen.
trips. You have a Volkswagen, a Volkswagen Bug.
A Volkswagen Bug wasn't big enough, and my older brother had a truck, a pickup truck, that he really no longer wanted to use. And he said, "You can have it." Well, Mark had a little bit of money left over from his broken neck. And he said, "Well, we could use that to go get the truck." So I took off to get the truck in LA. And on the way back, I stopped at my mother's in Fresno, and the truck was having problems. And it turned out it took about a week to rebuild the engine and make it the rest of the way to Sacramento.
And by the time he got there, I had knocked on enough doors that the calendar, Fred sort of looked at the calendar and how many weeks we had trips back to back. And
Yeah.
I recall he was a little taken aback that we didn't leave time for weekend, or I didn't think about weekend time. We just sort of did trips back to back to back. And and then the other element was that, again, you can have a raft, but you've got to have a frame. And then Fred and Ron just masterfully made these stunning basket boat frames, which are unique and heavy. And just watching these two guys master.
This is out of
their
welded
skill.
muffler pipe,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. And who else was guiding for you at this point? Was it you guys just doing your own trips, or were there other people guiding for you now?
At first, it was just the two of us. So we had two boats. We could carry, it was 8 people, and eventually we had the extra boats. So, other people would volunteer. So other
We talked to friends and
Yeah.
talked to other boatmen.
So in 72, you would have done 10 trips?
No, we had, it was.
There's
2-day
more
trips
calendar than that.
during the week.
Two,
For 2 or 3 months, we had back-to-back trips with almost no breaks.
wow.
And it was just constant. And again, Ron was doing the coordination of making sure, people were there and knew where to meet and all of those things.
For comparison, since I was managing a commercial company at that point, guides who had 10 back-to-back 2-day trips were burned out at the end of it. But you were doing this for almost 2 months.
It was, I mean,
It was a lot.
yeah.
but it didn't seem like that back then.
Yeah.
To me, it was so renewing. I mean, it was just amazing watching these kids light up, how many people lit up. And then, again, this might be another chapter, but, we came up with the first moonlight run. And by now, our campmates joined us, and it's, so it was punctuated with, we were always having fun.
You're doing dozens of trips a year, scores of trips a year. What was it like to be on one of your trips? Because as a commercial guide, I know we had our gear and our people and much different routine, and we'd see you guys all the time with these floppy basket boats and put together almost nothing for gear, and yet having a great time. What was it like being on those trips?
I would, when we had to finally come up with the name, people say, well, what do you do? Well, we do river trips, we do sort of outward bound adventure, and we do nature, etc. And so we could never really crystallize what we did. And we were always, as we were learning, we were teaching these young kids who had, most of them had never been out of this inner city. And so we were teaching what we could. We were exploring, went into the caves. What do you guys remember from those?
She can't talk.
Jacqueline, what do you remember?
One thing I'd like to add to this little beginning story is that the three of them, when they started doing these river trips, whoever was describing who they were, well, who are you? Well, if it was Fred, he would say Mark, Ron, and Fred. If it was Mark, he would say Fred, Ron, and Mark. If it was Ron, he would say Mark, Fred, and Ron. And so they were all so humble, and they, nobody wanted to put themselves first on the list. And then very quickly it turned into the three of them, Mark, Ron, Fred, etc., because there were, etc., other people helping do trips.
You'd never know who. It'd be different boatmen that were hanging around the river, and you just, if you knew them and knew they could row, you'd say, hey, I need a new boatman on Monday. Anybody want to help?
Yeah.
And these trips, Ron would tell us about that he has a trip coming up of 12 or 14 kids and counselors, and we wouldn't know who was coming or what they were like. We would kind of get a general idea, but then there'd be a period on the river. There's a period of getting to know them and trying to know what to share with them, and it just was like nothing that I'd ever been involved in.
And they had no experience of what it was like to prepare them either.
And some of them had never been camping before.
They were very scared, afraid of being outside in the dark, no walls, really afraid,
So that part of it was getting to know them, and as you were saying, learning how to do things with folks, and
it was a lot of work. I remember one trip in particular, you said that, commercial companies would bring a lot of stuff. Well, it was raining, starting to rain pretty hard that night. So they completely de-rigged 2 boats, brought them up on the shore and tilted them up to act like a big tent, and threw a tarp over the top, and then just lined up all these kids like cordwood underneath these 2 boats. I mean,
what I actually remember,
we never had tents.
It was Sacramento County Girls School, and I remember Fred and I had both waited and going, oh, it looks like it's really raining here in California in the summer. And once we had the A-frame tent, we would go find these girls, pick them up by the sleeping bag, and we just tossed them underneath. And by the time we had gathered everyone, there was room for just the 2 of us on the edge. It's like they had all self-organized underneath the...
Yeah. And, the tables were the deck. You had to de-rig anyway for the tables. And everything was done on the fire. So you cooked on the fire, you had to collect wood. So they would stop on the way down and collect wood.
No tables, no chairs. You just find a place to sit.
No tents, no pads, just a sleeping bag,
One of the things I remember was, again, because we were low budgeting, one woman, Joyce Harper, a junior high school teacher from San Leandro, would organize 2 or 3 trips that were paid trips, so they were less than commercial, but her kids would chip in, and that would essentially give us the money for those costs that we never quite calculated on. And the lesson I got was that the kids from this relatively wealthy neighborhood, compared to these kids who didn't have anything, they were all just kids. And there was something about being on the river. Some kids had parents to go home to, and the other kids didn't. But the difference between delinquent and normal, there wasn't. They were just kids with energy, and it was just that was one of my key lessons that year.
Jacqueline, these guys have got this thing going, and Nan Cassidy is going to join us here a little bit.
There we go.
Her voice is a little limited, but you had talked about how you were camped at the river, and then you ran into these guys and saw them. How did your relationship evolve to the point where you became part of, et cetera?
They were paying rent.
They were paying rent to
Dan.
To Dan, the guy who...
And we were free.
You were free, yeah.
Well, they were camping on one side. We saw them going by in these bigger boats. We had this little miniature boat that we go back and forth across the river. And we wanted to do that. And we went over and got to know them. And what can we do? How can we help? you can do shuttle, you can drive our truck back. So,
Well, and I recall that again, something happened with Dan because we had been camped on his side and he was making money with all the outfitters arriving. And he sort of said, well, you know, I mean, he appreciated we were doing free trips. So I don't recall anyway, but he said, why don't you go camp on the other side? So
Yeah.
we had to talk with you guys, but all the guides arrived, kept saying, and there's 3 women camped on the other side of the river. And we suddenly had to talk with you guys, and the camp was big enough that, big enough for the Boco Loco Rojo, the red truck. And
right, we started figuring out how we could do the shuttles, but also get on the trips. And as we were on the trips, we were like, oh, you know, we'd like to try rowing, or would you like to try rowing? They were so wonderful sharing that skill with us. But I also remember, Dan, you were staying there at first, and partly you were hauling his garbage out, remember?
Oh.
And so we even
Okay.
did that a couple of times. But maybe it got too much or whatever, and they ended up on our side of the river, yeah.
Ron, you were telling us a little bit about how you can recall taking somebody who was blind down, and that became a hallmark for ETC to take disabled people. Let's talk about where that all came from and what that experience was like. Ron?
I think the experience first started off with, my memory was with Center for the Blind Association, and if I recall, it was Catherine Ross that was associated with them. But essentially, we started taking down blind people that had just transitioned, moving into apartments on their own. They had no idea about what they could really do in life. Most of what they had defined as what they could do in life was defined by other people, their parents, their friends, their associates, their counselors. And now all of a sudden you throw them out someplace that is wild rapids, and you talk to them about swimming in these rapids. You talk to them about walking along in through the outdoors, and they start to realize that, hey, I can set my own boundaries. I can turn around and do a lot of other things, a lot more than what other people tell me I can do. And then I think from there we started to shift a little bit on our focus to realize, you know, maybe that's some of the people we really need to be targeting. People that have been told what they can't do their whole lives, to start instead saying, what can you do?
So Ron talks about the shift of taking people on who were disabled, blind, or otherwise had mobility impairments, and that the focus became what they could do, not what they couldn't do. How did that experience work for you guys as you were doing these trips that involved mostly able-bodied people to all of a sudden now people who couldn't move in the world as well as normal able-bodied people can?
again, it was my hunch is that again, some of these, some commercial companies did some of these trips, and then like Catherine Fox learned about us and then started trying to do it through etc. because it was hard for them to raise money for a full commercial trip. So we certainly, the door opened up, and it was just so powerful to learn to see. I remember being we would always take people into Coral Cave, and one of the things we would do is actually turn the lights off, and then people would be panicked, and we'd have them slowly learn to get out. Well, when we did that with the blind, it was amazing to watch them go, oh, let me show you the way. And I remember one time hearing Dennis Van say, wow, come and look at this. This is the most beautiful formation. I mean, Dennis is blind. What's he saying? And then I watched him reaching behind some formations that none of us will ever see, and he was showing another blind person with his hand a formation in the back of the cave. So those, yeah. One trip I remember was we actually had both delinquents and blind, and it was amazing watching the delinquents have to help the blind on shore, and then when we got in the cave, the blind all showed up and helped everyone else. So it was interesting. I found myself going, we call it disabled. I'm going, well, there's people who have physical disabilities. We all are disabled emotionally, but these people are just the vibrancy of their, and again, as Ron implied, there's sort of different levels of them learning to be with their own bodies. And it was a time, the whole movement was for the disabled community to be independent living centers. And so river running became an access to them, to the outdoors. And it was beautiful to feel that doors open for them, and we got to be...
So this is essentially 1975, 76, when there is more of a presence of disabled people on the river.
That probably came, yeah. With Ron and Fred at 72, 73, 74, and yeah, and then it
Started.
and these other things, all of these began and they grew.
In 73, ETC made a move to become a more substantial formal organization. Where did that all come from? Ron, do you want to start that out?
Part of the reason why that all came about is I would go around to different foundations, and I recall some foundations in San Francisco. I'd talk about this wonderful concept of doing free river trips, and they nodded their head yes, it sounded wonderful. And then they'd always come down to say, but are you a nonprofit organization? And I'd say, no, we're not. It's just, 3 individuals that started off, and they say, well, unfortunately, unless you become nonprofit, we can't help you financially. As much as we'd love to, we can't do that. So then it kind of morphed then over into a need to become a more organized, if you will, more organized entity, and decided that nonprofit would be the way to do it. Graciela Rossi was really critical in that era there too. And then John Titchener, if I recall correctly, he was finishing up law school, wasn't he? That he was becoming a lawyer, and then he was willing to draft the incorporation papers for us.
Yeah.
Could be John was an Arta guide who was an area manager in 74 for them, but it could be that maybe that was before.
He was studying.
I don't think he ever became a lawyer, but he was studying the law.
He was studying, and he said he could help us with the paperwork.
The incorporation work, yeah.
Yes.
You guys want to pick that up?
To pick it up, it was just, I remember the 3 of us talking about how we didn't understand it all, but it sounded like a good thing. It sounded like a step forward.
The only thing I remembered is that when we went to incorporate, we found out that et cetera, which was all we were called by then, because instead of Ron, Fred, and Mark, et cetera, it was just, well, we're just et cetera. And so with that name was already taken. So I remember a half dozen was sitting on the floor of my mom's house, and we all were trying to figure out what could ETC mean. Yeah. And Greg Coldwell finally came up with Environmental Traveling Companions. And so, that sounds okay. We'll just call ourselves et cetera. But in the eyes of the state, but we'll only be ETC.
I remember that too. Yeah.
That's good.
And that's where the name comes from, and still going to this day.
To this day.
Along with the incorporation stuff, we talked a lot about, we didn't want this to become some great corporate magnet that, other people decide on. So if I recall correctly, we wrote in the Articles of Incorporation that there would be an annual vote, that everybody that participated in river trips got a chance to vote as to the direction of what ETC was going to be taking place for the next year or the following year. We wanted it to be a really people's corporation, if you will.
And how did that work out, Ron?
Not too well.
It's a pretty hefty bar to get over. But it speaks to the moment in time in the 70s, and it speaks to your character as wanting no formal structures and just let everybody take care of their own energy working together.
I do recall that as the challenge, as Fred and Ron started moving on, it was much trickier because boats needed repairs. I mean, they had all the equipment in shape. I mean, they were things that I never paid attention to. They always did. And when people loved the idea, but they didn't have the diversity of skills or the paying attention. The two of them were just masters at paying attention to details, and so it kept going.
But we didn't teach
And it was, they didn't pass it on because they just did it. And as the next generation came, it was like, oh, how do you repair boats? Who's going to do that?
You know,
And so,
an example of that is that I ended up doing some commercial trips after also working with et cetera. And I watched those guys patch boats, Fred in particular, and and the way they would cut, around on the oval, and they'd put a patch on the inside, a patch on the, and we ended up getting a hole on a commercial trip, and nobody knew what to do. I became the expert, and I was like, no, you don't just put it on the top, you got to put it underneath first, you got around the corners, and I didn't realize how much skill they brought to their jobs. It was skill instead of money.
And you have to realize that the equipment that et cetera had was mostly in need of constant repair.
It was definitely, that was the key thing. It was mandated because we inherited, I mean, Ron was smart enough to know how to get the difference between neoprene-coated nylon versus cotton, and he knew the cotton would explode too quick, so we always made sure that when we found boats, they were neoprene, but they would still explode when we're off at lunch, so, and our boats always needed patching, and other people would buy companies would buy new boats, and no one had to learn the skills that...
After a while, yeah.
Yeah.
It became
Fred's deep integrity has always been a guiding pulse in my life of, again, just living in honesty. So these two people to me were just extraordinary teachers for me, and I think it's why that rooted, et cetera, in this deep integrity that Ron conveyed and deep trust of each other, and it seemed to draw people with that same vision to how do we help, we get to learn why we get to help teach what we're learning is along the way, and an amazing experience.
It drew people into that vision. They became a part of that same vision, I think, on the trips, the kids as well as the adults and counselors.
The combination of Fred's vision that started it, and then the vision of integrity that kept growing with how do we serve in life? We get to share the magic of this sacred
And besides,
together.
you can have fun.
Yeah, right.